Hey sensory. Hey sensory.
Hello.
Hey sensory. 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 Hey sensory.
Sensory? Sensory?
Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night.
Good night, Sensory. Have a good one.
Good
You
night,
can see
sensory.
what I can see.
Good night.
Yeah.
Good night, Sensory.
Good night, sensory.
Bye, Sense.
Bye bye. Thank you very much for visiting. See you around another time. Good night, sensory. Hey, good night. Good night, sensory.
See you later, Sense. See you later, Sensory.
Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night, sensory. Have a good night. See you.
Good night, Sensory. Bye, Sensory.
Good night, sensory. Good night. Oh, see ya later, sensory. Okay. Good night, sensory. Good night, sensory. Good night, sensory. Okay, bye, sensory. Thanks for visiting. Thanks for coming by. Hey, sensory. Good night, buddy. Good night.
Good night, Sense. Peace, Sense. See you later, Sensory.
Hey, good night, sensory. Thanks for coming. Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night, sensory.
Good night, Sensory. Have a good one. Good night, Sense.
Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night, sensory. Hey, good night, sensory. Good night. Good night. Good night. Sensory. Good night. Good night, sense. Good night. Good night. Good night, sensory.
See you, Sense. Thanks for hanging out. Oh, see you later, Sensory. Have a good one. Bye, Sensory. See you later, Sense. Have a good day at work.
Good night, sensory. It's not yet night, but good night, sensory. Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night, sensory.
See you later, Sense. Goodbye, Sense. Good night, Sense.
Good night, sensory. Good night, sensory. Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night. Okay. Good night, sensory.
See you, Sense. Have a great day. Bye, Sensory. Good night, Sensory.
Good night, sensory. Okay, sensory. Thank you. Thank you very much. See you later. Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night. Okay, good night, sensory. Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night, sensory.
Have fun at work. Different. Thank you, Sense. See you, Sense. Have a good day. See you later, Sensory.
Good night, folks. Good night, good night, good night, sensory. Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night, sensory. I didn't know you were here. Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night, sensory. Hey, good night, sensory. Good night. Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night, sensory. Thanks for coming by. Hey, sensory. Good night. Good night. Good night, sensory.
Good night, girl. I'm actually gonna sleep early. Okay, have a good early sleep.
Night, sensory. Okay, later, sensory. Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night, sensory. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night, sensory. See ya. Good night. Good night. Sensory. Good night.
See you later, Sense.
Sensory, bro, I don't even know what to say to you half the time. I don't know what to say to you.
Who's that? Who is that? Sensory.